Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, emotions run deeper than ever as Diep faces not only the challenges of her illness, but also the harsh judgment from James's mother. When Mrs. Huyen accuses Diep of being unfit for her son because of her genetic disease, a painful confrontation tears through their fragile peace. As love collides with fear and understanding battles against prejudice, James must stand between the two women he loves most, his mother and the woman who has already given him her heart. Stay with us until the end to see how compassion, courage, and forgiveness reshape the meaning of family in the face of impossible choices. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The early morning sun spills across the quiet countryside, painting the room in soft gold. Diep sits by the window, her hands resting on her lap, the hospital discharge papers folded neatly beside her. The world outside feels calm. Birds calling, wind brushing the rice fields. But her heart is anything but peaceful. After months of treatments, she's finally home. Yet peace feels distant. Her illness, the genetic condition she's carried all her life, has always been a quiet shadow in the background. But now, that shadow has grown heavier, following her into every moment of her recovery. The wooden door creaks open. James steps in, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Morning," he says softly. "You slept well?" Diep forces a small smile. "Better. The bed doesn't creak like the hospital one." She tries to sound light, but her voice carries the weight of exhaustion. James sits beside her, holding a bowl of warm porridge. "Mom asked me to make sure you eat," he says, setting it in front of her. For a moment, there's silence, just the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then, his mother's voice echoes faintly from outside, calling me to come eat breakfast. The calm cracks when Mrs. Huyen enters the room. Her smile is polite, but tight, her tone clipped. "You look stronger, Diep," she says, setting down a tray of fruit. Her words seem kind, but her eyes carry something else, an unspoken distance. Diep nods, trying to stay polite. "Thank you, Auntie. I really appreciate everything you and James have done." But before she can continue, Huyen interrupts, her tone sharpening slightly. "James tells me the doctor said your illness might come back any time." The air turns thick. Diep's hands tremble as she lowers the spoon. "Yes, the doctors can't be sure. It's a hereditary condition, but I'm getting better." Huyen's lips press into a line. "You're young, Diep. I'm sure you want a family, a future. But have you thought about what it means for James? For Nye?" James looks up sharply. "Mom!" She raises a hand. "Let me finish." Her voice is steady but cold. "You're a good girl, Diep. Sweet, hardworking. But this illness, it isn't something that just affects you. If you and James have children, what then? What if they inherit it?" Diep's eyes widen. "Auntie, But the older woman doesn't let her speak. "I lost my husband young, Diep. I know what it means to suffer alone. I don't want that for my son, or for a little girl like Nye to grow up seeing sickness as normal." James's patience snaps. "Mom, that's enough." His voice trembles with anger. "You don't understand. Diep's been fighting harder than anyone I've ever known. You can't just reduce her to an illness." Huyen turns to him, her tone cold but steady. I understand perfectly. I'm his mother. I see what you don't. Love makes you blind, James. Diep lowers her gaze, the warmth in her chest replaced by a deep ache. The porridge cools on the table, untouched. She whispers, she's right. Maybe I am being selfish. James reaches for her hand. No, you're not. You've done nothing wrong. But Huyen's expression hardens further. You don't see it now, but one day, when she's too weak to work, when you're carrying everything alone, you'll remember this conversation. The words slice through the air. Diep's heart clenches. The silence afterward is unbearable. Finally, she whispers, Auntie, I would never want to burden James, or anyone. Huyen's tone softens slightly, but only out of pity. I know, dear, but sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes letting go is the kindest thing. She turns and leaves, closing the door gently behind her. The sound echoes in the quiet room like a final judgment. Diep's shoulders shake, and tears spill down her cheeks. James gathers her into his arms, his own voice breaking. I'm so sorry. She doesn't mean it. She's just scared. Diep shakes her head. No, she's not wrong. Outside, Nai's laughter floats in from the garden, bright and innocent, a reminder of the life still blooming around them. But inside, the air feels heavy, thick with words that can't be taken back. That afternoon, the tension lingers like a storm cloud. Diep sits by the window again, the sunlight shifting across the floor. Her mother comes in quietly, carrying folded clothes. You should rest, she says softly. Diep looks up, her voice distant. Mom, am I being unfair to him? To James? Her mother hesitates, then sits beside her. Fairness isn't about sickness, child. It's about honesty. You've never hidden your pain. If James stays, that's his choice. But his mother doesn't want me, Diep whispers. Her mother sighs. Mothers fear what they don't understand. Maybe she just needs time, or maybe she never will. But love isn't something you beg for. It's something you prove. The words settle deep in Diep's chest. Outside, the wind moves through the rice stalks, their green blades shimmering in the fading light. When James returns that evening, his face is tired, eyes shadowed. He kneels beside her chair, taking her hand once more. I talked to Mom, he says quietly. She won't change her mind right now, but I don't care. I'm not leaving you. Diep looks at him, tears brimming. You shouldn't have to choose between us. He smiles faintly. I'm not choosing, Diep. I'm standing where my heart already is. The night deepens, and they sit together in silence, the soft hum of crickets outside wrapping around them. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet fear grows in Diep, a fear not of dying, but of becoming the reason James loses his family. As the moonlight filters in, she closes her eyes, the weight of love and guilt pressing against her fragile heart. Tomorrow will bring another conversation, another chance, or another wound. Yet for now, she clings to his hand, holding on to what little certainty she has left. That love, even under the harshest scrutiny, still beats steady in the dark. The following morning, the house feels colder, quieter. The smell of porridge still lingers in the air, but the warmth from yesterday has long faded. Diep wakes to the faint sound of Ni's laughter outside, mixed with the rhythm of a broom sweeping the front yard. For a brief second, It almost feels normal. But then she hears Mrs. Huyen's voice again. Measured, calm, but laced with disapproval. James is outside, talking to his mother under the shade of the guava tree. Diep can't hear every word, but she doesn't need to. She feels every syllable in her chest. "Mom, please," James says, his tone low but tense. "You can't treat her like this." "I'm not treating her badly," Huyen replies sharply. "I'm being realistic. You're my son, and I won't watch you walk into a lifetime of pain." Diep's heart tightens. The walls feel thinner now, every sound cutting through. "Pain?" James repeats, disbelief lacing his words. "You think loving someone sick is pain? She's the strongest person I've ever met." Huyen's voice wavers for a moment, but she quickly recovers. "Love fades, James. Illness doesn't. You'll understand that when you're the one sitting in a hospital room, holding her hand, praying she wakes up again." Her words stab like glass. Diep grips the blanket tightly. Her breathing quickens. Each word feels like a reminder of her fragility, something she's tried so hard to hide. When James storms back into the house minutes later, his face is flushed, eyes dark with frustration. Diep looks up, trying to steady her voice. "You argued again?" He sighs deeply, running a hand through his hair. She doesn't get it. She thinks being sick makes you less deserving of love. Diep's gaze drifts toward the window, where sunlight spills through the wooden slats. "Maybe she's right to worry," she says softly. "If I were her, I'd be scared too." "Don't say that," James snaps gently, but there's a crack in his tone, half anger, half pain. She smiles faintly, eyes glistening. "James, I know what I am. I wake up every day wondering if my body will betray me again. That's not easy for anyone to live with, especially someone who's already lost so much." James kneels before her, taking her hands. "Then let me choose that. Let me stand beside you through it all. You're not a burden." Her voice trembles. "But your mother thinks I'll destroy your future." He exhales slowly, lowering his head. "Then I'll build a new one, with you." The quiet that follows feels sacred, fragile, but outside, the tension still brews. That afternoon, Mrs. Huyen returns, carrying a basket of freshly washed fruit. She pauses at the doorway, eyes falling on the couple sitting close together. Her expression softens, just a little, but the wall between them remains. "James," she says, her voice firm, "I'd like to speak with Diep. Alone." James hesitates, glancing at Diep, who nods weakly. He squeezes her hand and leaves the room, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, the two women sit in silence. The ticking clock feels unbearably loud. Finally, Huyen speaks. "When I was your age," she begins, her tone unexpectedly calm, "I thought love could conquer anything. I believed that if two people truly cared for each other, the rest would work itself out. I was wrong." Diep listens quietly, unsure where this is going. "I buried my husband before I turned 30, Huyen continues. "I raised James and Nye alone. Every night, I prayed they'd never have to face what I did, watching the person they love fade away. When I see you, Diep, I see myself again, and that terrifies me." Tears burn at the corner of Diep's eyes. "Auntie, I never wanted to bring that fear into your family. I'm trying, really trying." to get better. Huyen's eyes soften slightly, but her words stay guarded. You're brave, Diep. I can see that. But bravery doesn't stop fate. James deserves a future filled with life, not hospitals. Diep swallows hard. And what about love? Doesn't he deserve to choose what makes him happy? Huyen exhales, her face shadowed by conflict. Sometimes love asks for sacrifice. You can love someone deeply and still know they're not meant to share your path forever. Diep's heart cracks. So, you want me to leave him? I want you to think about what's best for both of you. Huyen says quietly, if you truly love him, you'll understand. The words echo painfully. Diep lowers her gaze, her tears falling silently onto her hands. Huyen stands, her expression unreadable, and leaves the room. That night, James finds Diep sitting outside on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The moon glows above the rice fields, silvering the water's edge. He sits beside her, his voice gentle. She talked to you, didn't she? Diep doesn't answer right away. Her voice, when it comes, is barely a whisper. She's not cruel, James. She's just afraid. And maybe she's right. Maybe you'll wake up one day and realize you deserve someone healthier, someone who can give you more. James turns toward her, eyes fierce. Don't you dare say that. You are my more, Diep. You're everything I've ever wanted. Tears spill freely down her face. Then promise me something. Anything. If I get worse again, if it ever comes back, don't stop living. Keep the farm, keep Nee smiling, keep your heart open. Don't let me be the reason your world stops. James cups her face gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. Diep, I didn't fall in love with you because you're perfect. I fell in love because you're real, strong, kind, stubborn, and alive. I'm not leaving. Not now. Not ever. She closes her eyes, letting his words sink in like a balm. The night air carries the scent of earth and jasmine, the quiet hum of crickets weaving through their silence. Behind them, Mrs. Huyen watches from the window, her heart heavy. She doesn't speak, but for the first time, she sees something she hadn't before. Diep's quiet resilience, the fire in her eyes despite the fragility of her body. Days pass. Diep begins walking short distances again, her strength returning slowly. James stays by her side, helping her around the farm, teaching her to breathe through the fatigue. The walls that once divided them start to crumble, one small moment at a time. And though Mrs. Huyen still worries, something in her changes too. One evening, she brings a bowl of soup to Diep's bedside. Eat, she murmurs, almost awkwardly. You'll need energy if you want to plant those lilies you talked about. Diep looks up in surprise. Their eyes meet. No more accusations, only quiet acceptance. Later that night, Diep stands by the window, watching the fireflies drift above the rice fields. Her voice, soft but steady, fills the room. I don't know how long I have, James, but for now, I want to live, truly live, with you, with your family, with Nye. James slips his arm around her shoulders. Then that's exactly what we'll do. The stars shimmer faintly overhead, their light reflecting in her eyes. And in that moment, despite the uncertainty ahead, peace finally finds its way back into her heart. Love, fragile yet fierce, has chosen to stay, defying fear, defying fate, and illuminating the darkness one breath at a time.